Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Midnight Storyteller. If you're new here, welcome. If you're back, it's good to have you. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's begin.
The rain had been falling for hours, a steady beat that seemed to echo in the empty streets. Clara's car wipers barely cleared the fog that had settled on her windshield, making it difficult to see even a few feet ahead. She had driven down this long stretch of highway countless times, but tonight it felt different, like the road was leading her somewhere she didn't want to go. As she glanced at the clock on her dashboard, her stomach sank. It was already past midnight, and the house she was heading to was almost another hour away. She had always hated driving at night, especially when the rain made the road slippery, but there was no turning back now. The invitation had been unexpected, and now she couldn't ignore it. A few days ago, Clara received a strange message on her phone. It was from an unknown number, a brief text that simply read, "Come to the old house at the end of Highway 21. I'm waiting." The message had been followed by a series of strange, cryptic symbols. She didn't recognize the number, and the tone of the text was unsettling. But curiosity had gotten the best of her, and she decided to go. With the rain pouring down, Clara's thoughts swirled. Who could have sent that message? A part of her considered the possibility of a prank, but another part of her, the part she couldn't ignore, told her to follow the strange invitation. The further she drove, the more isolated the surroundings became. Tall, twisted trees lined both sides of the road, their branches swaying like ominous figures in the shadows. There were no other cars on the road, no streetlights, just the flickering glow of her headlights illuminating the endless dark stretch of road ahead. Suddenly, as she rounded a sharp bend, she saw something up ahead. A large, imposing house stood in the distance, its silhouette barely visible through the mist. It was old, abandoned-looking, with windows that seemed to watch her as she approached. Her heart raced in her chest as the realization hit her. This was it, the house she had been invited to. The driveway was long and winding, flanked by overgrown bushes and neglected hedges. Clara slowed down as she approached the front of the house, parking her car near the front steps. She sat for a moment, staring at the structure. The windows on the second floor were dark, and the front door, slightly ajar, creaked in the wind. The air felt heavy, as though the house itself was breathing. A strange shiver ran down her spine. Clara grabbed her umbrella and stepped out of the car. The rain felt colder now, sharper, as though it was cutting through her clothes. She walked slowly toward the front door, each step echoing in the still night. When she reached the door, it creaked open without her having to touch it. The house felt wrong, as if it was waiting for her to enter. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The hallway was dark, with only the faintest light coming from a single candle at the end of the hall. The smell of mildew and dust filled her nose. The walls were lined with faded photographs, their frames cracked and peeling. Clara hesitated, but then the sound of footsteps caught her attention. Someone was inside. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding strange in the empty house. No response. Just silence. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and Clara's heart began to race. She turned to head back to the door, but when she reached for the handle, it slammed shut on its own. The sound was deafening, and Clara spun around, panic rising in her chest. A figure appeared at the end of the hall. It was tall, draped in dark clothing, its face hidden in the shadows. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the figure took a step forward. "I've been waiting," a low voice rasped. Clara's pulse pounded in her ears. The figure moved closer, its eyes glinting in the dark. The voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it. "Who are you?" she gasped. The figure smiled, a slow, unsettling smile. "I know who you are. I've been watching you." Her legs felt weak, but she couldn't look away. There was something about the figure, something that made her heart race with a sense of dread she couldn't shake. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice whispered. "But now you'll never leave." Clara turned to run, but the house seemed to shift, the walls closing in around her. The air grew thick with the sound of footsteps behind her, growing louder, faster. When she finally reached the door, It wouldn't open. Her hands fumbled against the handle, desperation flooding her every movement. But it was too late. The last thing Clara saw before the darkness closed in was the figure standing behind her, its eyes glowing in the dim light, its smile growing wider. And then, nothing. The next morning, the house stood empty once more. The rain had stopped, and the sun's first rays illuminated the dilapidated structure. But Clara was gone. The only trace of her ever being there was the faint sound of footsteps, still echoing in the walls. The first time Claire saw the woman in the raincoat, she thought nothing of it. It was late, and she was walking home from her evening shift at the diner. The streets were empty, the air thick with the scent of wet pavement. Ahead, under the flickering glow of a streetlight, stood a woman in a long yellow raincoat, head bowed, hair dripping with rain. Claire walked past her without a second thought. The second time, it felt off. It was the next night. Same route, same empty streets. And there, under the exact same streetlight, stood the woman in the yellow raincoat, her head tilted slightly upward this time, as if she were watching Claire from beneath the shadow of her hood. Claire's steps faltered, her stomach twisted. She picked up her pace, her breath tight in her chest, refusing to look back. The third time, she knew something was wrong. She hadn't taken the same route. She had gone 2 blocks over, cutting through an alley to avoid the streetlight. But as she emerged back onto the sidewalk, her heart nearly stopped. The woman was already there, standing at the edge of the street, perfectly still. But this time, her head wasn't bowed. This time, Claire saw her face, or at least what should have been a face. There was nothing beneath the hood, just a smooth, featureless void where eyes, a nose, a mouth should have been. Claire gasped, stumbling backward, her entire body cold with fear. The woman moved, not walking, not stepping, just shifting. One moment she was across the street, the next she was closer. Claire turned and ran. Her pulse pounded as she darted through alleyways, her breath ragged, her hands shaking. She didn't stop until she reached her apartment, slamming the door shut, locking every bolt, every chain. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her ears strained for any sound outside. Silence. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe she was tired. Maybe a soft knock at the door. Claire's blood turned to ice. Slow, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. She held her breath. The peephole. She just had to look through the peephole. With a shaking hand, she reached up and peered through. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Claire let out a breath, her body sagging in relief. She turned away. Tap, tap. Her stomach dropped. She turned back, looked through the peephole again. This time, she saw it. The yellow raincoat. Right outside her door. But there was no face, just darkness. And then slowly, so slowly, the hood began to pull back. Claire screamed. The next morning, her apartment was found empty, the door still locked from the inside. But the raincoat? It lay neatly folded at the foot of her bed. And the security camera outside her apartment? It captured only one thing. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the hallway lights flickered, and for a split second, standing right outside her door, was a faceless figure in yellow, smiling. The first thing Olivia noticed about the apartment was the silence. Not the comforting kind. The oppressive, unnatural kind, like the walls themselves, were listening. She had just moved in, excited to start fresh in a new city. The place was cheap, a little too cheap, but she didn't ask questions. It was modern, spacious, and fully furnished. The only strange thing was the mirror. A full-length, antique mirror stood in the bedroom, its frame carved with intricate symbols that had faded with time. It was bolted to the wall, impossible to move. She didn't think much of it. At least, not until she looked into it that first night. The reflection was wrong. Not by much, just enough to make her stomach twist. The angle of the furniture seemed slightly off. Her reflection blinked a fraction too late. And when she turned away, she could have sworn she saw herself still staring. Goosebumps prickled her skin. She laughed it off. Maybe she was just tired. But then, the noises started. At night, she'd hear soft whispers, just below the threshold of understanding. A shuffle of movement, like bare feet against the floor. She told herself it was the neighbors, thin walls, old pipes. Until one night, when she woke up and saw it. A shadow in the mirror. Not her, something else. It stood in the reflection just behind her bed, motionless, watching. She bolted upright, heart hammering. But when she turned, there was nothing there. She barely slept after that. Every night she tried to ignore the whispers, the flickering movements in the corner of her eye. But the more she ignored them, the worse they got. One night, unable to take it anymore, she grabbed a bedsheet and threw it over the mirror. The whispers stopped. The weight in the air lifted. She slept soundly for the first time in weeks. But in the morning, the sheet was gone. She found it crumpled in the corner, as if someone had ripped it down. And when she looked back at the mirror, her reflection was smiling. But she wasn't. A cold wave of terror washed over her. She lifted a trembling hand to her face. The reflection did the same. But that smile remained, stretching unnaturally across her face like a grotesque mask. And then, her reflection moved. Not a delayed reaction, not a trick of the light. It moved on its own. It took a step forward. She stumbled backward, heart pounding in her ears. The reflection pressed its hands against the glass, fingers bending at unnatural angles. And then, it whispered, "Let me out!" Olivia screamed. She grabbed the nearest thing, a lamp, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered, shards flying everywhere. The pieces reflected her terrified face, distorted and broken. She panted, staring at the ruined frame. The weight in the air had lifted. The whispers had stopped. But then, from somewhere inside the broken mirror, a soft knock. Her stomach turned to ice. She backed away, refusing to look, refusing to believe. Then another knock. Louder, closer. And then, a shard of glass shifted. A single bloodied finger pushed through. That was the last straw. Olivia ran, grabbing her keys and bolting out of the apartment, leaving everything behind. She never returned. A few weeks later, a new tenant moved in. The mirror had been repaired. And when the new tenant looked into it, she saw Olivia, trapped, knocking. The sound of a baby crying in the middle of the woods is not something you ever want to hear. It was past midnight when Jake first heard it, a distant wail cutting through the silence of the forest. He had been camping alone, miles away from civilization, enjoying the solitude. But now his gut twisted with unease. There shouldn't be a baby out here. He grabbed his flashlight, stepping cautiously out of his tent. The sound was faint, but constant, coming from deep within the trees. His breath formed clouds in the cold air as he moved toward the source, boots crunching against the damp earth. The crying grew louder, desperate, pained. Jake hesitated. Something felt off. The way the sound carried through the air, it wasn't natural. It wasn't coming from a specific direction. It was just there. Still, he pressed on, his heart pounding as he pushed through the underbrush. And then suddenly he saw it. A cradle. A wooden baby cradle, rocking ever so slightly. Alone, in the middle of the forest. Jake's breath hitched. The crying was coming from inside it. Slowly, he stepped closer, raising his flashlight. The cradle was old, the wood weathered and cracked, as if it had been out here for years. A soft, white blanket lay bundled inside, shifting ever so slightly with the movement. Jake's hands trembled as he reached forward. He pulled the blanket back. There was nothing there. The crying stopped. His stomach twisted in horror. The night fell into complete silence. No wind, no insects, nothing. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. And then, a whisper, right behind him. "Put it back." Jake spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. No one was there. His breathing came in short, panicked bursts. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The air around him felt heavy, pressing against his chest like unseen hands. And then, the cradle. It started rocking again. Back and forth, back and forth. Jake stepped back, shaking his head. He turned and bolted, crashing through the trees, branches clawing at his arms. He didn't care where he was running. He just needed to get away. Behind him, the crying started again. Louder. Closer. It was following him. Jake ran faster, lungs burning, until he saw the faint glow of his campfire through the trees. He burst into the clearing, nearly collapsing as he reached his tent. And then, everything went quiet. Too quiet. His campfire, which had been burning steadily when he left, was out. His tent flap was open. Something was inside. Jake swallowed hard, raising his flashlight with a shaking hand. The beam swept across the inside of his tent, illuminating his sleeping bag. Something was in it. He took a slow step forward, his pulse hammering. The blanket shifted. And then, a withered hand reached out. Jake screamed. The next morning, a group of hikers found his campsite. The tent was torn apart, his gear scattered. But there was no sign of Jake. Only the cradle remained. Sitting in the center of the clearing, rocking, and from somewhere deep within the woods, faint and distant, a baby cried. She wasn't smiling, but her reflection was. For a moment she stood frozen, breath catching in her throat. Her fingers trembled as she raised her hand. The mirror copied her movement perfectly, but the smile remained. It wasn't wide or exaggerated, just a small, almost amused smirk curling at the corners of her reflection's lips. Her stomach twisted. She blinked hard, telling herself she was imagining things. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe the dim bathroom light was playing tricks on her. But when she looked again, the smile was still there. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She lifted her hand again, this time slowly, watching every tiny movement. The reflection matched it, every subtle twitch, every angle, except for the expression. Her own face remained still, neutral, but the version of her in the mirror looked pleased, as if it had been waiting. A sharp knock on the bathroom door made her jump. "Hey, you okay in there?" It was her roommate. She forced a laugh, though her voice came out too tight. "Yeah, just zoned out." The smile in the mirror seemed to widen. She turned away quickly, flipping the light off as she stepped out. But as she pulled the door shut, she could swear she saw her reflection, still standing there, watching. She told herself to let it go. It was just her mind playing tricks, right? But then things started changing. The next morning, as she brushed her teeth, she avoided looking directly into the mirror. But she could feel it, like eyes pressing into her, waiting for her to meet its gaze. Then as she turned to grab her towel, she caught a glimpse of movement, just a fraction of a second off. Like her reflection had hesitated. She whipped around, heart hammering, but everything looked normal. Almost. She stared at her own face, her own eyes. And for the first time, she noticed something else. The reflection's pupils were slightly wrong. Not quite centered, not quite hers. A cold shiver crawled up her spine. She needed to get out of that bathroom. The moment she stepped away from the mirror, relief flooded through her. But that relief vanished the second she passed the hallway mirror. She wasn't in it. The space where she should have been was empty. Her breath came in sharp gasps, panic clawing at her throat. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over herself, then turned and ran to her room, slamming the door shut. She refused to look in any mirrors after that. She covered them all, avoided reflective surfaces. But they were everywhere, windows, phone screens, puddles on the pavement. And sometimes when she caught a glimpse out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, watching, waiting. One night she woke up to a faint noise, a soft, almost wet tapping sound. Her stomach clenched as she turned toward the source, the covered mirror in the corner of her room. Something was knocking from the inside. The fabric shifted slightly, a bulge pressing outward, as if something was trying to push through. She couldn't breathe. Then, a whisper. "Let me out." Her scream caught in her throat as she lunged for the lamp, flooding the room with light. Silence. The knocking stopped. The shape behind the fabric was gone. But as she sat there, shaking, she knew one thing for certain. She had made a mistake. Because mirrors don't knock. And reflections don't smile on their own. It was the perfect night for a road trip. Clear skies, a soft breeze, and the kind of silence that only the open road can provide. Mia had been driving for hours, following the winding highway through sleepy towns and thick forests. She'd been feeling a little nostalgic, visiting some old friends in a distant town. But now it was time to head back. The drive home would take another couple of hours, but Mia didn't mind. She liked the solitude, the peaceful hum of the car as it sped along the road. But then something strange happened. She noticed a figure standing at the side of the road. It was just a shadow at first, barely visible against the dark backdrop of the trees. But as she approached, it became clearer. A woman, standing motionless in a white dress. Mia's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't that she was afraid, but there was something about the way the woman stood there, staring straight ahead, that felt off. She drove past without slowing down, but couldn't shake the eerie image of the woman from her mind. A few miles later, she glanced in her rearview mirror. The woman was still there, standing on the roadside, now looking right at her. Mia's pulse quickened, and a knot formed in her stomach. How was that possible? She hadn't seen the woman when she passed by, but now she was behind her. Mia wasn't sure what to make of it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or her tired eyes playing tricks on her. But it felt wrong. Trying to shake the unease that had settled in her chest, she pressed the pedal a little harder, trying to leave the unsettling image behind. The road stretched on, dark and desolate. The trees loomed on either side like towering sentinels, blocking out the stars above. Mia couldn't stop looking in her rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman again. And there she was, still standing in the same spot. But this time, Mia saw something she hadn't noticed before. The woman was no longer standing still. Her head was tilted unnaturally, and her body was slightly hunched as though she were following Mia, moving with unnatural speed. The woman's gaze was locked on the car, her eyes wide and unblinking. A shiver crawled up Mia's spine. Suddenly, the headlights flickered. Mia's heart raced, and she slammed her foot on the gas pedal, speeding down the road. But no matter how fast she drove, she couldn't escape the feeling of being followed. In the distance, she saw the woman again, only this time she was walking. Or was it running? It was hard to tell, but one thing was certain, she was getting closer. The car began to sputter, the engine making strange noises. Panic surged through Mia's veins as she steered the vehicle to the side of the road. She hit the brakes, hoping to stop safely, but the car jerked to a halt with a sickening lurch. The engine cut out completely. Mia sat frozen, staring out of the windshield at the dark road ahead. She had to calm down, think clearly. But as she turned the key in the ignition, the car refused to start. The air around her grew colder, the hairs on her neck standing on end. She heard something in the distance, footsteps. Slow and deliberate, like someone walking toward her. And then through the window, she saw it. The woman, standing right next to the car. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her face was pale, drained of color. Her mouth was slightly open, as though she were trying to say something, but no sound came out. Mia's breath caught in her throat, her heart racing wildly. She didn't know what to do, but the terror inside her was paralyzing. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling, only to find the screen cracked and the battery dead. And then, without warning, the woman opened her mouth, and for the first time, Mia heard the sound. It was a low, guttural voice, barely a whisper, but it was clear enough to send a wave of ice down her spine. "Help me." The words echoed in her mind, as if the woman's voice was coming from all directions. Mia's instincts screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. She was trapped. The woman's eyes locked with hers, and for a fleeting moment, Mia felt a strange pull, a sense of familiarity, as though she had seen this woman before. But no, it couldn't be, could it? "Help me," the voice repeated. And just like that, Mia understood. She wasn't looking at a stranger. She was looking at someone she had known, someone who had been lost, someone who had died. The woman wasn't asking for help. She was warning Mia, warning her to stay away from the place where it had happened. But Mia didn't have time to process it. The world around her began to fade, the woman's face melting into the darkness as the air grew colder. And then, everything went silent. When Mia woke up, she was back on the road. The car was running again, the headlights bright and steady. The woman was gone, the trees were silent, and the road stretched ahead of her like nothing had ever happened. But the image of the woman's face, her lifeless eyes, haunted Mia every night after that. She couldn't shake the feeling that, somewhere in that darkness, she hadn't escaped at all. She had only been allowed to leave. For now. The little girl woke up to the sound of soft breathing. It was coming from the doorway of her room. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, just the strange noises of the old house settling in the night. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw a shadow standing there. A familiar figure. It was her mother. She stood still in the doorway, her face hidden in the shadows, her posture eerily stiff. The girl, barely 6 years old, felt an instant wave of comfort. Maybe her mom had come to check on her, to make sure she was sleeping soundly. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice groggy from sleep. No response. The figure just stood there, breathing slowly, softly. A small shiver crept up the girl's spine. Something about the silence felt off. "Mom?" she said again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. Then her mother did something strange. She slowly, so very slowly, tilted her head to one side. The movement was unnatural, jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. The little girl felt her stomach twist. Something was wrong. Then, from behind her, she heard the sound of sheets rustling. She turned her head, and there, in the dim light of the moon, she saw her real mother, lying in bed, fast asleep, her breath caught in her throat. If her mother was right there, then who was standing in the doorway? Her tiny body froze. The shadow in the doorway hadn't moved, but she could still hear the breathing, deep, slow, deliberate. It almost sounded like a whisper, as if the thing was mimicking the sound of her mother's breath. The little girl squeezed her eyes shut. Maybe if she didn't move, it would go away. Maybe she was just dreaming. But then, the breathing got closer. She could hear it now, louder, inches from her bed. Her tiny hands clenched the blanket, pulling it up to her chin. And then, silence. The breathing stopped. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, suffocating. Slowly, heart-pounding, the girl peeked over the edge of her blanket. The doorway was empty. The figure was gone. For a brief moment, relief washed over her. Maybe she really had imagined it. Maybe it was just a trick of the dark, just her sleepy mind playing games. Then she heard it. A whisper. Right next to her ear. Go back to sleep. A scream lodged in her throat, but before she could make a sound, something cold brushed against her cheek. She bolted upright, her tiny hands shaking as she reached for the lamp beside her bed. The second the light flooded the room, she gasped. The doorway was still empty. The room was still. Her mother was still sound asleep, undisturbed by any of it. The only thing that had changed was her closet door. It was open. Just a crack. And inside that thin sliver of darkness, she saw something. Two pale, glassy eyes staring back at her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run to her mother's bed, but her body refused to move. She was paralyzed in terror, staring at those unblinking eyes that glowed in the darkness. Then, slowly, excruciatingly slow, the closet door began to close. The eyes disappeared into the darkness. The click of the latch sent a shiver through her bones. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, she told her mother everything. But of course, she didn't believe her. It was just a nightmare, her mother said, brushing her hair back with a comforting smile. The girl didn't argue, but when her mother left the room, she hesitantly walked toward the closet. Her tiny fingers trembled as she reached for the handle. Slowly, she pulled the door open. Nothing. Just her clothes, her toys, the usual mess of a child's closet. But something felt wrong, and then she saw it. Carved into the wooden wall at the very back of the closet were 3 words, "I was here." She never slept with the closet door open again. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound in the sterile, white-walled room. The hospital felt eerily quiet for a late evening shift, as Dr. Charles Hayden prepared for another night of surgery. He'd done this countless times, and yet, tonight felt different. Maybe it was the dark clouds hovering outside the window, or the growing sense of unease that settled in his stomach. But something was off. He reviewed the file again. A routine surgery. A man named Mark Simmons, mid-30s, no history of complications, coming in for a relatively simple procedure. But as Dr. Hayden glanced at the clock, he realized it was already past midnight, far beyond the hours when normal patients would come in. There was a lingering strangeness in the air, one that he couldn't shake. Mark arrived shortly after, wheeled into the operating room on a gurney by a nurse. He was unconscious, breathing steadily, with no signs of distress. Everything seemed normal. Dr. Hayden spoke to the anesthesiologist, giving the go-ahead for the procedure. He watched as the sedative took effect, the patient's body growing slack with each passing moment. The room filled with the mechanical whir of equipment, and Hayden made his first incision. As he worked, however, something felt strange. The usual rhythm of the surgery was interrupted by a gnawing feeling deep in his gut. Every time he moved, every time the scalpel slid through tissue, his eyes kept drifting back to Mark's face. There was something off about it, something unsettling. He paused, wiping his brow, and looked closer at the monitor. The patient's vital signs were still normal, but there was a slight fluctuation that hadn't been there earlier. Strange, too strange. His heartbeat seems a little erratic, Dr. Hayden muttered under his breath, but the machine didn't indicate any real danger. The rhythm was steady, almost too steady. Minutes passed, and just as Hayden thought everything was back on track, he heard a soft sound from the table. A faint breathing, almost imperceptible, but still there. It couldn't be. The sedative should have kept Mark unconscious, deeply so. He glanced up at the nurse, who seemed unfazed. They'd been in and out of surgeries countless times together, and he had never seen her look so distracted. Her eyes were fixed on the corner of the room, and she seemed to be holding her breath, as though waiting for something. But there was nothing to wait for. This was a routine surgery. As he pressed on, the breathing sound grew louder, more pronounced, almost as though it was coming from Mark's mouth, but not quite. Dr. Hayden's hand faltered. His nerves were playing tricks on him, he told himself. Yet something tugged at him. Something was terribly wrong. It wasn't the kind of noise a sedated patient should make. He took another breath, focused on the incision, trying to push the creeping feeling of dread away. That was when he noticed it. Mark's eyes. They were half open, but it wasn't the soft fluttering of someone in deep sedation. No, these eyes were moving, darting underneath the lids, trying to open. A chill ran down Dr. Hayden's spine. "Something's wrong," he muttered under his breath, stepping back. He called out to the nurse. "Can you check on the monitors? Something doesn't feel right." The nurse didn't respond, still frozen in place, her eyes glued to the same corner of the room. Dr. Hayden turned to look, but saw nothing there. No shadow, no movement, just the flickering lights above. His pulse quickened. The room suddenly felt too small. The walls seemed to close in as the air grew thick and stifling. He turned back to Mark, but the patient's eyes had shifted, no longer trapped under the lids, but wide open, staring directly at him. A rush of panic surged through his chest. "Mark?" Dr. Hayden whispered, stepping closer. But the patient's eyes didn't blink. They didn't shift. They just stared. Then the strangest thing happened. Mark's lips parted slightly, and out came a single low word, a whisper that chilled Dr. Hayden to his core. "Help!" It was the faintest of sounds, barely audible, but unmistakable. There was something wrong with the way the word hung in the air, something that made it feel far more sinister than any of the words he'd heard from patients waking up after surgery. Something wasn't right. Mark was supposed to be unconscious. The patient's body stiffened as though jerking from an unseen force, and Dr. Hayden's stomach churned in disbelief. It was as if Mark was fighting against something, some invisible force trying to hold him down. The room seemed to pulse with tension. Every breath felt harder to take. "Get him off the table," Dr. Hayden shouted, panicking, but the nurse remained still staring at the same corner of the room. She didn't respond. His hands shook as he looked back down at Mark. The man's eyes were wide open now, fully conscious, yet his body remained limp and unresponsive. It was impossible. Mark couldn't be awake. He couldn't be aware. Sedatives like that were too strong, too potent to wear off so quickly. And yet, here he was, staring up at him with an expression of sheer terror. Suddenly, the room lights flickered, plunging the operating room into near darkness. The hum of the machines ceased, and in the silence, Mark's lips parted once more. "Help me," he whispered again, but this time his voice was deeper, darker, distorted. Dr. Hayden staggered back, almost tripping over his own feet. The last thing Dr. Hayden remembered was his own scream, drowning in the unbearable sound of Mark's voice, one that didn't belong to a living person. The lights flickered once again, and then everything went black. When the authorities arrived later, they found Dr. Hayden unconscious on the floor of the operating room. Mark Simmons' body had vanished, leaving behind only an empty, blood-stained table. There were no records of his surgery, and no sign of a man named Mark Simmons anywhere in the hospital system. As though he had never existed at all. But Dr. Hayden knew better. He would never forget the haunting whispers or the terror in Mark's eyes, the eyes of someone who had died long before the surgery even began. The old amusement park had always intrigued Michael. He had heard the stories about it, how it had been abandoned decades ago, how no one ever dared to go near it. He was always curious about the past, about what things were like before the world moved on. So, one late evening, when he found himself driving through the rural outskirts, he couldn't resist the pull of the empty park, nestled between the overgrown trees, the rusted gates barely hanging on their hinges. With a sense of nervous excitement, Michael parked his car just outside the entrance. The sky had already darkened, and the wind picked up, rustling through the dying leaves. The air was thick with the scent of decay, like the park itself was holding its breath. He could hear the faint creaking of metal, the sound of a forgotten carousel turning in the wind. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, but he shook off the feeling. This was just a place frozen in time. There was nothing to fear. As he stepped past the broken gates and into the park, a sense of unease settled in. The once bright colors of the rides had faded to dull shades, the murals on the walls peeling away. The place was a ghost town, untouched by human hands for years. Still, there was an eerie beauty to it, like a memory that had lingered too long, unwilling to leave. Michael walked deeper, past the dilapidated roller coaster, the rusting Ferris wheel, and the empty game booths. But as he approached the center of the park, something caught his eye. It was the carousel. Despite the years of neglect, the carousel was still intact, its colorful horses still standing in place, frozen mid-ride. But there was something wrong. The music. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it was unmistakable. The haunting, sweet melody of a carousel playing. And it wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from somewhere within the ride itself. Michael's pulse quickened. The carousel was broken. He knew that. The power was long gone. Yet the music played on. It was soft at first, like a lullaby, but with every passing second, it grew louder, more insistent, until it felt as if the park itself was alive. Michael hesitated, his mind screaming at him to leave, to turn around and drive as far away from this place as possible. But his feet betrayed him, pulling him forward to the carousel, to the source of the haunting sound. The closer he got, the more he could make out the shapes on the ride. They were not the usual colorful horses that would have once been there. These were figures, dark and twisted, the horses now grotesque, their eyes wide open and unblinking, their smiles too sharp, too wide. He stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stared at them. The figures didn't move, but the music continued, louder now, almost deafening. A cold chill ran down Michael's spine. He tried to turn and run, but his legs wouldn't move. The sound of the carousel spinning grew louder and faster. The figures' eyes seemed to follow him, their smiles widening ever so slightly, as if they were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Then he saw something that made his stomach churn. In the reflection of one of the cracked mirrors near the ride, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the carousel. A man, tall and thin, dressed in an old, tattered suit, his face obscured by a dark, wide-brimmed hat. Michael felt a bead of cold sweat trickle down his neck. He blinked and looked back at the man, but the figure was gone. The reflection, however, remained. The music grew louder, and Michael felt as though it was vibrating through his bones, filling his body with a sense of terror he couldn't shake. It wasn't just the carousel anymore. The park itself was alive. He could feel the ground beneath him shifting, as if something was moving below, something ancient and forgotten. The once dormant rides began to creak and groan, as if stirred from a long slumber. The Ferris wheel, which had been still for decades, shuddered to life, its lights flickering, casting long, distorted shadows across the park. The games booths rumbled as if something inside them was moving, waiting. Michael stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest, but before he could run, the carousel's music stopped. And then, silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Michael felt the weight of it pressing down on him, like the entire park was closing in around him. He didn't dare move. He was trapped in the stillness, every muscle in his body frozen in fear. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. Low, raspy, as if it was coming from the very earth beneath him. "Why did you come here?" it whispered. Michael's breath caught in his throat as the ground beneath him shifted. The carousel began to move again, slowly at first, but then faster and faster, the figures on the ride twisting, turning, their heads jerking toward him, their eyes glowing red. The music resumed, now distorted, warped, as if it had been taken over by something dark. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The park had come alive. And it was no longer just a forgotten relic of the past. It had been waiting for someone to return, and now that someone was him. With a final scream of terror, Michael ran, but the ground seemed to twist beneath his feet. The carousel spun faster, the shadows reaching for him, and the dark figure in the hat reappeared in front of him, blocking his escape. His blood ran cold as he realized he had made a fatal mistake. The park had claimed him, just as it had claimed countless others before him. The carousel's music echoed in the distance as Michael's screams were swallowed by the night. And in the darkness, the park waited, once again, for its next victim. The church had been abandoned for decades, its towering bell spire silhouetted against the night sky like a forgotten relic. No one in town went near it. The doors were locked, the windows covered in grime, and the foundation was crumbling. But every night at exactly 4 a.m., the bells would ring. At first, people thought it was the wind. Then, they blamed pranksters. But the police never found anyone, and the mechanism to ring the bells had long since rusted over. Yet, the bells never missed a night. One night, Daniel, a journalist, decided to investigate. He had heard the stories growing up, the eerie sound of bells in the dead of night, the shadows that moved in the high windows, the rumors that no priest had ever left that church alive. Most people in town had learned to ignore it, to stay in their homes and pretend the bells didn't exist. But Daniel wanted the truth. Armed with his camera and flashlight, he walked up the cracked steps leading to the church's entrance. The heavy wooden doors groaned under his touch, but wouldn't budge. He moved along the side of the building, finding a broken window just big enough to slip through. The glass crunched under his boots as he landed inside. The air was thick with dust and decay. Wooden pews, long abandoned, were covered in white sheets, giving them the eerie appearance of shrouded figures. The altar stood at the far end, the once brilliant stained glass behind it dulled with age. But it was the silence that unsettled him most. He checked his phone, 3:50 a.m. The bells would ring soon. His breath quickened as he moved toward the bell tower's spiral staircase, his flashlight casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. The wood creaked beneath him, and for a moment he thought he heard another set of footsteps. He froze, turning quickly. Nothing. Just the empty pews below. The air shifted. It felt heavy, charged like the moments before a storm. Daniel continued up, heart pounding. He reached the top, stepping into the belfry. The massive bell loomed above him, unmoving, covered in cobwebs. The ropes that once controlled it were cut, frayed edges swaying slightly in the breeze that filtered through the broken tower window. And yet, dong! The sound nearly knocked him off his feet. His ears rang as the bell swung, though no one had touched it. Dong! The force of it rattled the walls, dust and debris raining from the ceiling. Daniel stumbled back, pressing himself against the stone railing. The final toll echoed through the empty town below. And then, silence. Daniel's hands trembled as he lifted his camera, snapping a photo of the swinging bell. But when he looked at the preview screen, his blood ran cold. There was something standing behind him. A figure draped in tattered robes, its face hidden in shadow, its long fingers stretching toward him. He spun around. Nothing, just the empty tower. His breath came in shallow gasps. He had to get out. Now. As he turned to descend the stairs, something stopped him. The dust on the floor, untouched for decades, had footprints. Not just one set, dozens. And they all led to the edge of the tower. His head swam. It didn't make sense. The town had been abandoned. No one had entered this church in years. But someone, or something, had been here. The bells rang again. This time, Daniel ran. By the time he reached the broken window, he didn't stop. He jumped through, hitting the ground outside with a hard thud. Pain shot up his arm, but he didn't care. He scrambled to his feet, sprinting down the road, away from the cursed building. The bells had never rung twice before. The next morning, Daniel checked his footage. The video was mostly static, the sound distorted beyond recognition. But there was one clear moment, just a second of clarity before the footage cut out. A voice, barely a whisper, beneath the final toll of the bell. You shouldn't have come. It wasn't until she walked into the old house that Emma felt the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. The air was thick with something that couldn't quite be explained, a palpable presence that sent shivers down her spine. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the small town knew about the house at the end of the street. The locals warned her, don't go near it, stay away from the old house. But Emma, ever the curious type, dismissed their warnings. She was fascinated by the history behind it. When Emma first moved to town, she was eager to explore, to uncover the secrets that the townspeople so desperately tried to avoid. And the old house, dark, decaying, with windows that seemed to watch you, was at the top of her list. It had stood there for decades, abandoned, its reputation more terrifying than its actual state. The stories surrounding it were twisted, some claiming that it was haunted, others that something far worse lurked there. One evening, when the sky hung heavy with clouds and the wind whispered ominously, Emma finally decided to see for herself. The house was at the end of a long, winding road. It loomed in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the murky sky. As she approached, her breath seemed to freeze in her chest. The feeling in the air grew denser, thicker, as though the house itself was trying to pull her in. Ignoring the rising unease in her stomach, Emma pushed open the gate. The rusty hinges screamed in protest. She stepped onto the front porch, her footsteps crunching over the dead leaves scattered across the floor. She noticed the door was ajar, a sliver of blackness beckoning her inside. Without a second thought, Emma crossed the threshold. Inside, the house was even worse than she imagined. The walls were crumbling, the floorboards creaked under her weight, and the air smelled stale, damp, like something had been rotting for years. The silence was oppressive. Every step she took seemed to echo throughout the house. But there was something else. In the far corner of the room, just beyond the entrance, Emma spotted a faint movement. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light. Someone or something was there. Her breath caught in her throat as she took a cautious step forward. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make her question her sanity. Was someone else in the house? Or was it just her mind playing tricks on her? She hesitated but pressed on, the need to uncover the truth outweighing the terror rising within her. As she made her way deeper into the house, the temperature seemed to drop. Her skin prickled as the silence deepened. The movement came again, this time more pronounced. From the corner of the room, something emerged, a figure, but not a human figure. Emma's breath hitched. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man. His body was hunched, his skin unnaturally pale, as though it had been drained of life. His eyes were wide and dark, hollow pits that seemed to stare right through her. He didn't move, only stood there, watching her with an intensity that felt suffocating. For a moment, Emma stood frozen in place. Then she turned and ran. She bolted for the door, but as she reached for the handle, the man's voice echoed in her ears. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't even a shout. It was as if the voice came from within her own mind. Don't leave. I've been waiting for you. She spun around in horror, but the figure was gone. The room was empty, but the door wouldn't open. She twisted the handle desperately, but it was stuck, as though the house itself was holding her inside. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and panic surged through her veins. She pushed harder, yanking at the door, but it refused to budge. And then, she heard it again. A soft, deliberate tapping. It came from the walls, from the floorboards, from above. The house was alive. With every tap, the sound grew louder, closer, as if something was crawling through the walls toward her. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to let her leave. Finally, with a final desperate push, Emma wrenched the door open and stumbled outside. She ran, not looking back until she reached the street, gasping for breath. The house loomed behind her, silent once more, as though nothing had ever happened. But Emma knew better. The house had seen her, and now it would never let her go. The first time Sarah saw the mannequin move, she convinced herself it was just her imagination. She had been working the closing shift at the department store for weeks, and exhaustion played cruel tricks on the mind. But that night, as she did her final rounds, she swore she saw it. Just a slight shift, a twitch in the fingers, the tilt of its head. She laughed it off, shaking her head. I need sleep, she thought. But the feeling lingered. The next night, it happened again. Sarah had been restocking shelves when she glanced up at the row of mannequins in the display window. They stood there, motionless as always, pale, plastic faces frozen in eerie perfection. But something was wrong. She was sure she had left them in different poses. One in particular had turned slightly, just enough that its blank face was now staring directly at her. A shiver crawled down her spine. She was alone in the store. She had been for the past hour. No one could have moved them. Still, she forced herself to brush it off. Maybe she had just forgotten their original positions. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her again. But the unease grew. By the third night, she started feeling watched. The security cameras were old, the grainy footage barely clear enough to make out details. But when she checked them during her break, something made her blood run cold. Between two frames, less than a second apart, one of the mannequins had shifted. Its arm had moved. Its head had turned. Sarah stared at the screen, unblinking. That's impossible. Her first instinct was to check the display in person. She told herself there had to be a logical explanation. But as she walked toward the mannequins, dread coiled in her stomach. The store was eerily silent, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above her. The closer she got, the heavier the air felt. She stopped in front of the display. They were standing there, lifeless. But then, one of them wasn't where it had been before. She backed away, heart hammering. She wasn't going crazy. Something was wrong. She decided to test it. That night, before she locked up, she placed a mannequin in a very specific pose. She positioned its arms, tilted its head to one side, and took a picture on her phone for proof. Then she left. When she returned the next evening, the store was exactly as she had left it. Except for one thing. The mannequin. It had moved. It was no longer in the pose she had placed it in. Now, its head was completely straight, facing forward, staring directly at her. A cold dread settled in her bones. Sarah wanted to leave, to quit on the spot. But she needed this job. She decided to keep her distance. As long as she didn't touch them, as long as she ignored stop. It didn't. The mannequins kept shifting, slowly, subtly, sometimes just an inch, sometimes more. She would turn her back for a second, and when she looked again, something was different. And then, one night, it went too far. She was alone, as always, closing up for the night. She had been avoiding looking at the mannequins altogether. But when she walked past the display window, something made her glance up. And that's when she saw it. One of the mannequins wasn't standing anymore. It was crawling. On its hands and knees, its stiff plastic fingers digging into the floor, its head twisted at an unnatural angle. Sarah let out a strangled scream, stumbling back. Her hands shook as she scrambled for her phone, trying to call someone, anyone. But before she could press a single button, the store lights flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, she heard it. A sharp plastic click, like a limb snapping into place. When the lights came back on, the mannequin was standing again, right against the glass. Sarah ran. She never came back. The store closed down a month later. No one knew why. But sometimes when people walk by at night, they swear they see something. A mannequin pressed against the glass, watching. The sound of the wind howling outside the car was deafening, but it didn't compare to the noise coming from the back seat. At first, Chloe thought it was just her imagination, the kind of eerie feeling that creeps up on you when you're alone on an empty highway at midnight. But then she heard it again, a soft, unnerving giggle, almost like the whisper of a child. She glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, but the back seat was empty. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the sensation. "You're just tired," she muttered under her breath. It had been a long day, and she was driving through the rural back roads to get home after a visit to her parents. There were no other cars on the road, no lights, just the oppressive darkness, and the occasional flicker of her headlights illuminating the narrow path ahead. But the sound came again, a high-pitched giggle that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. This time, it was accompanied by the unmistakable sensation of someone breathing. Chloe's heart skipped a beat. She whipped her head around, but still, there was no one there. Her mind was racing, trying to explain away the sound, but there was no logical reason for it. The hairs on her arms were prickling with an overwhelming sense of dread. Chloe's foot pressed down on the gas pedal, the engine roaring to life as she sped up, hoping to escape whatever was haunting her. But no matter how fast she went, the sensation only grew stronger, as if whatever was in the back seat was keeping pace with her. The giggling had stopped, but now there was something far worse, a whispering, low and menacing. It sounded like it was right behind her ear, though the seat was still empty. "Turn around," the voice breathed, so faint, so chilling that it sent a jolt of terror straight to her core. "Turn around, Chloe." Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tight, her knuckles went white. She knew she should pull over, should call someone, but every fiber of her being screamed to just keep going. The voice was almost a whisper now, but its urgency was unmistakable. "Turn around," it repeated, this time louder, more insistent, as if the words were being etched into her brain. Chloe could feel the panic rising in her chest. Was she losing her mind? Or was someone really in the back seat, playing a twisted game with her? Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again, this time scanning the dark interior of the car more thoroughly. That's when she saw it. A pale face, just barely visible in the corner of the reflection. It was a child's face, staring at her with wide, hollow eyes, its lips twisted into a grotesque grin. Chloe gasped and slammed her foot on the brake. The car screeched to a halt, throwing her body forward against the seatbelt. She quickly looked behind her, but the back seat was completely empty. Her pulse was hammering in her chest as she fumbled for her phone. Her hands were shaking so violently that it took her several tries to unlock it. She needed to call someone, anyone. But when she pulled up her contacts, something stopped her. Her heart froze. There was a new message in her inbox, a single line of text that made her blood run cold. "Turn around, Chloe." Her breath caught in her throat as she looked up. There, standing at the edge of the road, was a figure. A child. The same child from the back seat, only now it was standing in front of her car, eyes wide, staring at her with that same eerie grin. Panic surged through her as Chloe floored the gas pedal again, the tires screeching as she swerved around the figure. She didn't dare look back. The car rattled down the dark road, and Chloe's mind raced with confusion and fear. Was it a prank? Was someone messing with her? But she had no time to think about that. All she could focus on was the overwhelming need to get home. As the miles passed, the night seemed to grow darker, the road longer. But then, through the corner of her eye, Chloe saw something impossible. A flicker of movement. The child from earlier, standing by the side of the road, staring at her again, as if waiting. She sped up again, but the further she drove, the more she saw them. Figures, standing along the roadside, watching her, their faces pale and blank, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The giggling returned, louder now, echoing through the car. And then she heard it, clearer than before. The voice. "Don't run, Chloe. We're already here." She slammed the brakes again, heart racing, only to find herself in the same spot she had been before. The road, the figures, the child with the unnerving grin. Chloe's breath hitched as she realized she was trapped. The road was endless, looping back on itself. The last thing she saw before everything went black were the glowing eyes of the child, slowly inching toward the car, that cold, malicious smile spreading wider with every passing second. The storm outside howled against the windows as Mark sat alone in his apartment, the dim glow of his laptop screen the only source of light. It had been a long day, and he was about to turn in for the night when his phone vibrated on the table. A single text message lit up the screen. "Look outside." His heart skipped a beat. The message had no sender. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he hesitated to reply. A prank, maybe? Someone messing with him? He slowly turned his head toward the window, his pulse quickening. The street below was empty. Rain slicked the pavement, reflecting the flickering streetlights. No one was there, just the wind pushing against the trees, their shadows swaying unnaturally. Then his phone vibrated again. "I see you." Mark felt a cold chill creep up his spine. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the dark corners. Was someone watching him? His apartment was on the 3rd floor. How could anyone be outside his window? He forced out a shaky breath and typed back, "Who is this?" No response. Only silence. He grabbed his phone and stood up, cautiously approaching the window. He pressed his face to the cold glass, scanning the street once more. The empty road stretched into the distance. No cars, no people, nothing. Then his screen lit up again. "You're looking the wrong way." Mark spun around so fast he nearly fell backward. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes darted across the room. The closet door was slightly open. He hadn't left it that way. He was sure of it. His fingers tightened around his phone as he slowly approached the closet, the wooden floor creaking beneath his weight. His own breathing sounded too loud in the quiet apartment. He reached out, hand trembling, and yanked the door open. Nothing. Just his clothes hanging limply on their racks. The darkness inside felt heavier than it should. He exhaled shakily, letting out a nervous chuckle. Just then another message came through. Too slow. Mark's blood turned to ice. A sharp creak echoed behind him, the sound of a footstep. He turned just in time to see movement in the reflection of his bedroom mirror. A figure, tall, gaunt. Its face was wrong, distorted, stretched too wide in a grotesque grin. Its hollow eyes locked onto his, and before Mark could even scream, the figure lunged. Darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, Mark's apartment was quiet. The storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. His phone lay abandoned on the table, the screen cracked. A single message remained open. "Found you." But Mark was gone. His apartment was empty, as if he had never been there at all. The old house on the corner of Maple Street had always been there, standing like a forgotten relic, its paint peeling, windows clouded with dust. No one ever moved in. No one ever moved out. It just existed. One night, Olivia walked past it on her way home. The wind carried a faint whisper through the trees, something almost like her name. She paused, glancing toward the house. The porch light was on, but the house had been abandoned for years. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from an unknown number. "Come inside." Her breath hitched. She turned sharply, scanning the street. Empty. A chill ran down her spine, but she told herself it was nothing, just a prank, a coincidence. She picked up her pace, determined to ignore the unease creeping up her back. Then the second message came. "Don't run." She did. Her heart pounded as she sprinted down the sidewalk, her footsteps echoing against the quiet night. The streetlights flickered. The wind howled. When she reached her apartment, she fumbled with her keys, shoved open the door, and slammed it behind her. Safe. She let out a shaky breath, pressing her forehead against the cool wood. Her phone buzzed again. "You're home." "Good." Her stomach dropped. Slowly she turned. The apartment was dark, exactly as she had left it. Nothing was out of place. But something felt wrong. She locked the door, double-checking it before backing away, her eyes darting to the windows. Then she saw it. A figure. Standing just outside her window. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at her. She took a step back. Her phone slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The figure moved. Not forward, not to the side. It glitched. 1 second, it was outside. The next, it was inside. Olivia stumbled backward, a scream rising in her throat. The figure stood just a few feet away now, its face shrouded in shadow. Her phone vibrated once more. With shaking hands, she picked it up. Too late. The lights flickered, the shadows twisted, and then darkness. The next morning, Olivia's apartment door stood ajar. Her phone lay on the floor, the screen cracked, the last message still glowing. But Olivia was gone. And the house on Maple Street? Its porch light was off, waiting.